On the night of February 10, 1897, guests arrived at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City to find the entrance transformed into a recreation of Versailles. Gold leaf covered the walls. Crimson and white roses filled every corner. Footmen in powdered wigs and satin knee breeches lined the marble staircase, dressed as servants from the court of Louis XVI. Outside on Fifth Avenue, police struggled to control a growing crowd. They weren't there to admire. They were there to witness what the newspapers had been denouncing for weeks: the most extravagant private party ever thrown in American history, hosted during the worst economic depression the nation had ever seen. Inside, Cornelia Bradley Martin descended the grand staircase wearing jewels that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette herself. The same Marie Antoinette who had been executed by revolutionaries for her extravagance while the French people starved. The parallel was not subtle. The Bradley Martin ball cost approximately $369,200 in 1897 dollars, equivalent to roughly $13.4 million today. The event lasted 6 hours. Within 2 weeks, the family would be receiving death threats. Within months, their property taxes would be raised so dramatically they could no longer afford to live in New York. Within a year, they would abandon America entirely, fleeing to England where they would live in permanent exile. The Bradley Martin Ball was not simply a party. It was the moment American society drew a line, the moment when conspicuous consumption during mass suffering stopped being admired and became unforgivable. The moment the Gilded Age began eating itself. The Panic of 1893 began on May 5 when the Reading Railroad, one of America's largest companies, declared bankruptcy with liabilities of $125 million. The collapse triggered a domino effect that would devastate the American economy for the next 4 years. Within 6 months, the Erie Railroad failed. The Northern Pacific Railway followed. The Union Pacific Railroad went under. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway collapsed. By December 1893, over 15,000 companies had declared bankruptcy. 500 banks had permanently closed their doors, wiping out the savings of hundreds of thousands of depositors. The statistics tell only part of the story. National unemployment reached 18.4% in 1894, but that number doesn't capture the human cost. In New York City, an estimated 100,000 people were unemployed by the winter of 1893-94. Chicago counted 100,000 jobless. Philadelphia had 60,000. These weren't temporary layoffs. These were permanent job losses in an era with no unemployment insurance, no welfare system, no social safety net of any kind. Bread lines stretched for city blocks. Jacob Riis, the pioneering photojournalist, documented families living in tenement apartments measuring 10 feet by 10 feet, housing 8 or more people. Children as young as 7 worked 14-hour shifts in textile mills for $3 per week. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and cholera swept through overcrowded slums, where entire families shared single rooms with no running water and inadequate heat. The Depression did not end quickly. It persisted through 1894, worsened in 1895, continued through 1896, and was still affecting millions of Americans in early 1897 when Cornelia Bradley Martin began planning her party. Historians would later classify it as the worst economic crisis in American history until the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the spring of 1894, Jacob Coxey, a businessman from Massillon, Ohio, organized a protest march of unemployed workers to Washington, D.C. Coxey's army, as the press called it, demanded federal intervention to create jobs through public works projects. When approximately 500 marchers reached the Capitol on May 1, 1894, they were met by police. Coxey was arrested for walking on the Capitol lawn. No relief came. That same spring, workers at George Pullman's Pullman Palace Car Company in Chicago struck after the company cut wages by an average of 25%, while refusing to reduce rents in the company-owned town where employees were required to live. The strike escalated when the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, called for a nationwide boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. By late June, the boycott had paralyzed rail traffic across the western United States. President Grover Cleveland deployed 12,000 federal troops to break the strike, citing the need to ensure delivery of U.S. mail. The intervention turned violent. On July 7, 1894, troops and striking workers clashed in Chicago. By the time the strike ended, at least 30 workers had been killed and dozens more wounded. Eugene Debs was arrested and imprisoned for 6 months. The strike was crushed. This was the America of 1896 and early 1897. Unemployment remained above 14%. Wages for those who still had jobs had been cut repeatedly. Labor unions were being systematically broken by federal force. Families were being evicted from their homes. Children were dying of preventable diseases in overcrowded slums. And in this America, in January 1897, the society pages of New York newspapers announced that Mr. and Mrs. Bradley Martin would be hosting a costume ball at the Waldorf Hotel. The theme would be Versailles. Attendance would be limited to approximately 900 of New York's wealthiest families. Guests were expected to appear in authentic period costumes representing European royalty. The announcement included Cornelia Bradley Martin's stated justification for the event. According to reports published in the New York Times and other papers, Mrs. Bradley Martin explained that the ball would stimulate trade and help alleviate the depression. The logic was straightforward. If wealthy families spent lavishly on costumes, jewelry, and decorations, they would employ dressmakers, jewelers, florists, and caterers, thereby putting money into circulation and creating jobs. "I envisioned a party that would give an impetus to trade," she later wrote in her memoir. Many New York shops sold out their stock of brocades and laces which had been lying in their storerooms for years. The economic theory was trickle-down consumption articulated by someone who genuinely appeared to believe that purchasing a $10,000 costume to wear for a single evening would meaningfully help families struggling to afford bread. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Newspapers across the country published editorials condemning the planned ball. Religious leaders delivered sermons denouncing it. Labor organizers pointed to it as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of the wealthy class. The criticism came from unexpected quarters. Even some members of New York's social elite privately questioned the wisdom of such conspicuous display during a time of mass suffering. But Cornelia Bradley Martin did not cancel. She did not scale back. She doubled down. The Waldorf Hotel had opened in March 1893, just months before the panic began. It was built by William Waldorf Astor at a cost of approximately $5 million, making it the most expensive hotel ever constructed in America at that time. The hotel occupied the entire block of Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets. Its ballroom could accommodate 1,200 guests. Its kitchens were capable of preparing banquets for thousands. Its wine cellars held vintages that cost more per bottle than a factory worker earned in a month. The Waldorf represented everything the Gilded Age aspired to be: grand, luxurious, expensive, and utterly removed from the reality of how most Americans lived. It was designed as a palace for the new American aristocracy, a private world where millionaires could insulate themselves from the poverty that existed just blocks away. The timing of the Bradley Martin Ball was not accidental. February 1897 marked nearly 4 full years of continuous economic depression. 4 years of unemployment, hunger, evictions, and desperation. 4 years during which the wealthy had largely continued living as they always had, insulated by their fortunes from the suffering that surrounded them. The Bradley Martin Ball would force that contradiction into full public view, and America was watching. Frederick Townsend Martin was born in 1849 in Albany, New York, into a family of considerable but not extraordinary wealth. His father, Henry Hull Martin, had made his fortune in banking and real estate. Frederick grew up comfortably, attended good schools, and inherited approximately $3 million when his father died, equivalent to roughly $109 million today. He married Cornelia Sherman in 1877. She was the daughter of Isaac Sherman, a wealthy New York merchant. The marriage combined 2 fortunes and elevated the Martins into the upper tiers of New York society, though not to its very pinnacle. This was the essential problem that would drive everything that followed. The Martins were rich, but not Astor rich. They were socially prominent, but not Vanderbilt prominent. They existed in that uncomfortable space occupied by families who had enough money to live among the elite, but lacked the dynastic names or generational wealth that would guarantee their position indefinitely. Frederick Martin was, by most accounts, a genial man with expensive tastes and little ambition beyond enjoying his inherited fortune. He collected art. He traveled extensively in Europe. He was a member of the Union Club, the Knickerbocker Club, and other exclusive New York institutions. He published a book in 1911 titled The Passing of the Idle Rich, in which he reflected with remarkable self-awareness on the excesses of the Gilded Age and predicted that the era of hereditary wealth and conspicuous consumption could not last. But in 1897, that moment of reflection was still 14 years in the future. In 1897, Frederick Martin was focused primarily on maintaining and elevating his family's social position. Cornelia Bradley Martin was the driving force behind the ball. Contemporary accounts uniformly identify her as the organizer, the visionary, and the one who pushed forward despite mounting criticism. She was ambitious in a way her husband was not. She wanted to be remembered. She wanted to host the party that everyone would talk about for years to come. She had precedent to look to. New York society in the 1880s and 1890s had become increasingly competitive in its displays of wealth. The pattern had been established by earlier hosts who understood that social position could be claimed through spectacular entertainment. In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt had thrown a costume ball at her newly built Fifth Avenue mansion that cost an estimated $250,000, approximately $7.8 million today. The ball featured 1,200 guests in elaborate costumes. The Vanderbilt mansion itself, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, had cost $3 million to build. Alva's ball was credited with forcing Caroline Astor, the reigning queen of New York society, to formally acknowledge the Vanderbilts as social equals despite their relatively recent wealth. The lesson was clear. If you had money but lacked pedigree, you could buy social acceptance through conspicuous display on a scale so grand that it could not be ignored. In 1897, the Bradley Martins occupied a position similar to where the Vanderbilts had been in 1883. They had money. They lacked the ultimate social validation. Cornelia Bradley Martin decided she would claim it through a party that would surpass even Alva Vanderbilt's legendary ball. The Bradley Martins also had a brother who would play a crucial role in the story. Frederick's younger brother, Bradley Martin Jr., who lived in England and maintained close connections to British aristocracy. This connection would prove essential when the family later needed to flee America. By early 1897, the Bradley Martins were living primarily at their estate in Scotland, having already begun spending more time abroad than in New York. They maintained a brownstone at 20 West 20th Street in Manhattan, but used it primarily as a base for their annual visits to the city during the social season. This partial detachment from America may have contributed to Cornelia's profound miscalculation about how her party would be received. She had been living among European aristocracy, where lavish costume balls were an accepted part of the social calendar regardless of economic conditions. She appears to have believed that what worked in London or Paris would work equally well in New York. She was catastrophically wrong. The invitation list for the ball was carefully curated. Approximately 900 guests would be invited, representing the absolute pinnacle of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston society. The Astors would attend, the Vanderbilts, the Belmonts, the Whitneys. The list read like a directory of American plutocracy. The invitation specified that costumes must be historically accurate representations of European royalty, preferably from the court of Versailles during the reign of Louis XVI. This was not a suggestion. Guests who appeared in inadequate costumes would be socially humiliated. The competitive pressure was enormous. The result was a spending frenzy among New York's wealthiest families that began in January and accelerated through early February. Dressmakers, jewelers, and costume designers were commissioned to create outfits that would cost thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, for a single evening's wear. Mrs. John Jacob Astor reportedly spent $10,000 on her costume, equivalent to approximately $365,000 today. She would appear as Mary, Queen of Scots, wearing a velvet gown embroidered with real pearls and trimmed with ermine. The dress alone required 6 weeks of constant work by a team of seamstresses. Cornelia Bradley Martin's own costume, representing Mary Stuart, was even more expensive. Contemporary newspaper accounts estimated its cost at $15,000 to $20,000, approximately $547,000 to $730,000 today. The centerpiece was a necklace of rubies and diamonds that had genuinely belonged to Marie Antoinette, purchased at auction in Europe specifically for the ball. The symbolism was grotesque. Marie Antoinette had become synonymous with aristocratic indifference to the suffering of the poor. The phrase "let them eat cake," though almost certainly apocryphal, had become permanently attached to her legend as the ultimate expression of ruling class contempt for ordinary people's struggles. Whether or not she actually said those words, She had been executed during the French Revolution partly because of her extravagant spending while the French people starved. And now, in February 1897, during the worst depression in American history, a New York socialite would wear Marie Antoinette's jewels to a party themed after Versailles, the palace whose opulence had helped trigger revolution. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. Editorial writers pointed it out explicitly. Labor newspapers ran cartoons depicting Bradley Martin guests, dressed as French aristocrats being led to guillotines. Ministers quoted scripture about the rich man and Lazarus, warning that divine judgment awaited those who feasted while their neighbors starved. But Cornelia Bradley Martin pressed forward. She had committed to the ball. Invitations had been sent. Costumes were being made. The Waldorf Hotel had been reserved. She would not back down. What she failed to understand, what her social circle failed to understand, was that America in 1897 was fundamentally different from the America of 1883, when Alva Vanderbilt's ball had been celebrated as a triumph. The Depression had changed something essential in the national mood. The Pullman strike and its violent suppression had revealed the brutality underlying the Gilded Age's prosperity. Jacob Coxey's arrest had demonstrated the government's indifference to mass unemployment. The social contract that had allowed the wealthy to display their fortunes without fear of serious consequence was fracturing. The Bradley Martin ball would shatter it completely. By early February, as the date of the ball approached, newspapers were publishing daily updates on the preparations. The coverage was detailed, obsessive, and increasingly hostile. Every new revelation about the party's cost, every description of another outrageously expensive costume, every detail about the decorations and menu fed growing public outrage. On February 8th, 2 days before the ball, the New York World published a front-page editorial titled "The Bradley Martin Ball, a Study in Contrasts." The piece juxtaposed descriptions of the party preparations with statistics about unemployment, poverty, and suffering in New York. It ended with a question: is this America? Cornelia Bradley Martin had wanted to be remembered. She would get her wish, but not in the way she had imagined. The Bradley Martin Ball did not emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of 2 decades of escalating competitive display among America's wealthiest families, each trying to outdo the previous spectacle in a social arms race that had been building since the end of the Civil War. The Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain in his 1873 novel of the same name, was characterized by the rapid accumulation of unprecedented fortunes through industrialization, railroad expansion, and financial speculation. Between 1865 and 1900, America transformed from a largely agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse. That transformation created wealth on a scale never before seen in human history. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of America's oil refining capacity by 1880. His personal fortune would eventually reach an estimated $1.4 billion, equivalent to roughly $400 billion today, making him likely the wealthiest person in modern history. Andrew Carnegie's steel empire produced more steel than all of Great Britain by 1900. Cornelius Vanderbilt left a fortune of $105 million when he died in 1877, more than the entire US Treasury held at the time. This concentration of wealth demanded expression. The newly rich families of the Gilded Age faced a particular challenge: how to translate financial power into social legitimacy. Money alone was not enough. In New York society, old families like the Livingstons, the Schermerhorns, and the Stuyvesants looked down on the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, and the Astors as crude nouveau riche, regardless of how many millions they possessed. The solution was spectacle. If old money would not voluntarily accept new money would build palaces and throw parties so magnificent that acceptance became irrelevant. The architectural expression began first. Between 1880 and 1900, Fifth Avenue in New York was transformed into a showcase of competitive mansion building that rivaled anything in Europe. Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, became the architect of choice for families seeking to build monuments to their wealth. In 1879, William Kissam Vanderbilt commissioned Hunt to build a mansion at 665th Avenue at a cost of $3 million, approximately $93 million today. The mansion was a copy of the Château de Blois in France, complete with turrets, gargoyles, and a medieval Great Hall. It was the first of the great Gilded Age palaces, and it established the template: European aristocratic architecture imported to America and built on a scale that exceeded the originals. Alva Vanderbilt, William's wife, understood that the mansion alone was not enough. She needed an event that would force New York society to acknowledge the Vanderbilt name. The costume ball she threw on March 26, 1883, became the template for everything that followed. The preparations took weeks. The mansion was decorated to represent different historical periods in different rooms. The hall was hung with tropical plants and palm trees. The gymnasium was transformed into a forest. The third-floor suites became Venetian and Renaissance chambers. Alva hired 140 musicians and stationed them throughout the house. She commissioned special costumes for all the servants. She personally approved every guest's costume design in advance to ensure historical accuracy and appropriate magnificence. The guest list was deliberately exclusive, 1,200 people, representing only the very top tier of New York wealth. The Astors, the reigning first family of New York society, were initially not invited. This was the social power play at the heart of the event. Caroline Astor, known universally as the Mrs. Astor, had controlled New York society for decades through her annual balls and her alliance with Ward McAllister, who had coined the term the 400 to describe the number of people who truly mattered in New York. The Astors considered the Vanderbilts unacceptably nouveau despite their vast fortune. Alva's strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Her daughter Carrie Astor, Caroline's daughter, had been practicing for weeks with friends for a special quadrille they planned to perform at the ball. As the date approached, Alva informed young Carrie that she could not possibly attend the ball because Mrs. Astor had never formally called on Mrs. Vanderbilt, and therefore they were not acquainted. Caroline Astor was forced to choose between social principle and her daughter's happiness. On March 25, one day before the ball, Mrs. Astor's carriage pulled up to the Vanderbilt mansion. She left her calling card. The next day, Alva sent an invitation. The Astors attended. The Vanderbilts had arrived. The ball itself cost an estimated $250,000, approximately $7.8 million today. Newspaper coverage was extensive and largely positive. The event was treated as a triumph of American ambition and creativity. The costumes were described in elaborate detail. Alva appeared as a Venetian princess in a gown sewn with real pearls. Her sister-in-law dressed as the Electric Light, in white satin covered with diamonds, with a battery-powered torch on her head that actually illuminated. The message was clear: wealth, properly displayed, could overcome any social barrier. The lesson was learned by everyone watching. What followed was an escalating series of competitive displays that grew more elaborate and expensive with each iteration. In 1886, the Vanderbilts threw another ball, this time with an Oriental theme. In 1890, Mrs. William Astor gave a ball that reportedly cost $200,000. In 1891, the James Hazen Hydes hosted a ball where guests arrived in costume and the house was transformed into different historical periods in different rooms. Each ball was covered extensively in the newspapers. The society pages devoted thousands of words to describing costumes, decorations, and menus. The coverage served two purposes. It documented the event for those who attended, and it allowed everyone else to participate vicariously in the spectacle. But the tone of the coverage began to shift in the 1890s, particularly after the Panic of 1893 began. What had been celebrated as American achievement and cultural sophistication increasingly became criticized as grotesque waste during a time of mass suffering. The shift was visible in the coverage of the James Hazen Hyde Ball, held in January 1905 at Sherry's Restaurant in New York. Hyde, a 23-year-old heir to an insurance fortune, threw a Louis XVI themed costume ball that cost an estimated $200,000, approximately $6 million. He had the entire restaurant redecorated to resemble Versailles. He flew in French actress Gabrielle Réjean from Paris at a cost of $10,000 just to perform for one evening. The ball was spectacular. It was also a public relations disaster. Newspapers ran exposés revealing that Hyde had charged the cost to his company, Equitable Life Assurance Society, effectively making policyholders pay for his party. The outrage contributed to an investigation that revealed massive corruption in the insurance industry and led to Hyde's eventual exile to France. The lesson should have been obvious. By 1905, Throwing a Versailles-themed party during economic hardship was no longer acceptable. But the Bradley Martins had thrown their ball in 1897, 8 years earlier, when the lesson was just beginning to be learned. They would become the cautionary tale that taught it. The specific precedent that most directly influenced the Bradley Martin ball was the series of patriotic costume balls that had become fashionable in the 1890s. These events allowed wealthy families to dress up as historical figures while claiming they were celebrating American history and culture. In 1892, Mrs. John Jacob Astor had given a ball where guests came dressed as famous Americans. The event was well received. In 1895, the Vanderbilts threw a ball where guests represented different states of the Union. These parties demonstrated that historical costume balls could be socially acceptable if properly framed. But Cornelia Bradley Martin made a crucial error. She did not choose American history. She chose Versailles. She chose the court of Louis XVI, the king who had been overthrown and executed. She chose to celebrate French aristocracy at its most decadent moment, during an American Depression that had already lasted 4 years. The context was everything. In prosperous times, a Versailles ball might have been seen as harmless fantasy. In February 1897, with unemployment still above 14% and breadlines stretching through every major city, it was something else entirely. It was a provocation, and America was ready to respond. The transformation of the Waldorf Hotel began 3 days before the ball. Teams of workers stripped the ballroom of its standard decorations and began constructing what amounted to a temporary palace within the hotel's walls. The Grand Ballroom, which normally accommodated up to 1,200 guests, was reconfigured to hold approximately 900 for the Bradley Martin event. This reduction in capacity allowed for more elaborate table settings and wider spaces between dining areas, creating an atmosphere of even greater exclusivity. The decorating budget alone was estimated at $65,000, approximately $2.4 million today. 28,000 roses were brought in from florists across the Northeast. Orchids were shipped from as far as California. Palm trees in massive planters lined the walls. The ceiling was draped with garlands of smilax, a climbing plant fashionable in Gilded Age decor, interwoven with thousands of additional flowers. The color scheme was crimson and gold, deliberately chosen to evoke the palace at Versailles. Crimson velvet curtains hung from floor to ceiling. Gold leaf was applied to temporary architectural features built specifically for the evening. Massive mirrors in gilded frames were installed to multiply the visual effect of the decorations and the guests themselves. The dining tables were set with the finest china, crystal, and silver the Waldorf could provide. Each place setting included multiple glasses for different wines, gold-rimmed plates, and silverware bearing the hotel's monogram. The centerpieces were enormous floral arrangements interspersed with candelabras holding hundreds of candles. The menu, printed on silk cards with gold lettering, listed 11 courses. It began with oysters, consommé, and canapés. The fish course featured salmon and bass. The meat courses included filet mignon, terrapin, a type of turtle considered a delicacy, and several game birds including canvasback duck and partridge. Multiple vegetable courses accompanied each meat. The meal concluded with elaborate desserts, fruits, coffee, and liqueurs. The wine list was equally extravagant. Champagne flowed throughout the evening. Specific wines were paired with each course, including vintages that cost hundreds of dollars per bottle in 1897 currency. The total cost of food and beverages was estimated at $50,000, approximately $1.8 million today. But the real spectacle was not the decorations or the menu. It was the guests themselves. On the evening of February 10, 1897, carriages began arriving at the Waldorf shortly after 10 p.m. The ball was scheduled to begin at 11 p.m. and continue until dawn. This timing was deliberate. Fashionable society balls always started late and ran through the night, a demonstration that the participants had no need to wake early for work. Outside on Fifth Avenue, the crowd that had been gathering since late afternoon had swelled to an estimated 5,000 people. Police had erected barricades to keep the crowd back from the hotel entrance, but the barriers were constantly pushed and tested. The atmosphere was tense, hostile. Some in the crowd had come simply to watch the spectacle of the wealthy arriving in their costumes, but many had come to protest. Signs appeared denouncing the ball as an insult to working people. Shouts of "shame" and "remember the poor" were reported by newspaper correspondents covering the scene. The police presence was substantial. The New York Police Department, anticipating possible violence, had stationed more than 100 officers around the Waldorf. Mounted police patrolled the street. Additional officers were positioned inside the hotel itself. As each carriage arrived and guests stepped out in their elaborate costumes, the crowd's reaction ranged from awed silence to open jeering. The visual contrast between the costumed millionaires and the working-class protesters in plain clothes created a tableau that multiple newspapers would describe the next day as both magnificent and obscene. Cornelia Bradley Martin arrived wearing her costume as Mary Stuart. The centerpiece was the necklace of rubies and diamonds that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, purchased at auction in Paris the previous year. The gems caught the light from the hotel's entrance and the flashbulbs from photographers' cameras. Contemporary accounts estimated the necklace's value at $60,000, approximately $2.2 million today, though some sources suggested it was worth far more. A gown was made of white satin embroidered with pearls and trimmed with ermine. The train extended 15 feet behind her and required 2 attendants to manage. On her head she wore a diamond tiara. The total estimated cost of her costume, including the jewelry, was between $75,000 and $100,000, approximately $2.7 to $3.6 million today. Frederick Townsend Martin, her husband, wore considerably less elaborate attire, a costume representing a gentleman of the court of Louis XVI. His outfit included knee breeches, silk stockings, a powdered wig, and a coat embroidered with gold thread. The costume was expensive but not remarkable compared to many of the other guests. Mrs. John Jacob Astor arrived as Mary Queen of Scots. Her costume had been in preparation for 6 weeks. The velvet gown was embroidered with real pearls, thousands of them sewn individually onto the fabric. The collar and cuffs were trimmed with genuine ermine fur. She wore a fortune in diamonds and rubies at her throat and on her fingers. The estimated cost, $10,000, approximately $365,000 today. Auguste Belmont came dressed as the Duc de Guise, in a costume that included a sword with a jeweled hilt and a cape lined with silk. Anne Harriman Sands Rutherford appeared as Madame de Pompadour in an elaborate gown featuring real lace that had been imported from France and was said to be over 100 years old. Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt wore a costume representing a Venetian noblewoman, featuring a gown that contemporary descriptions valued at $8,500. George J. Gould appeared as Louis XV himself. Bradley Martin Jr., Frederick's brother, came as a courtier in an ensemble that included authentic 18th-century lace and silk. One of the most photographed costumes of the evening belonged to Miss Anne Morgan, daughter of J.P. Morgan. She appeared as Pocahontas in a costume that attempted to blend American history with European aristocratic styling, a confused choice that several newspapers would later mock as emblematic of the entire event's tone-deafness. The interior of the ballroom, when all 900 guests had finally assembled, presented a scene that witnesses struggled to describe adequately. The combined value of the jewels in the room was estimated by one insurance assessor at more than $5 million, approximately $182 million today. The diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and pearls worn by the guests created a glittering spectacle under the light of thousands of candles and the newly installed electric chandeliers. The evening followed a precise schedule that had been planned weeks in advance. Guests arrived between 10:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. A receiving line allowed each guest to be formally presented to the Bradley Martins. Dancing began at midnight. Supper was served at 2 a.m. More dancing followed until 5 a.m., when carriages were called to take guests home. The dancing was formal and structured. A full orchestra of 60 musicians played waltzes, quadrilles, and cotillions. The most elaborate dance of the evening was a special quadrille performed by a select group of guests who had been practicing their choreography for weeks. The dance was meant to evoke the formal court dances of Versailles, complete with bows, curtsies, and intricate patterns. The supper represented the culinary pinnacle of the evening. The 11 courses were served at a pace designed to last nearly 2 hours. Each course arrived with appropriate ceremony. Footmen in powdered wigs and livery served from silver platters. The champagne never stopped flowing. Contemporary accounts from guests who later wrote about the evening emphasized the beauty, the elegance, the perfection of every detail. One attendee described it as the most perfectly appointed ball ever given in New York. Another called it a vision of another age brought to life. But even some of those who attended expressed private misgivings. Ward McAllister, the social arbiter who had helped define New York society's rules for decades, was reported to have said during the evening that the ball, while magnificent, had been ill-timed. Others whispered similar sentiments, but were careful not to say anything publicly that might offend their hosts. The ball ended shortly after 5 a.m. on the morning of February 11th. The last guests departed as dawn was breaking over Fifth Avenue. Many were driven directly to their homes to sleep through the day. Some stopped at after-party gatherings at private residences to continue celebrating and discussing the costumes they had seen. The morning newspapers hit the streets of New York on February 11, 1897, and the reaction was instantaneous and savage. The New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's flagship paper, ran the story on the front page under the headline, "The Bradley Martin Ball, Vanity Fair in full blast, while thousands are in want." The coverage included detailed descriptions of the costumes and decorations, but framed within a withering editorial commentary about the moral implications of such spending during a depression. The New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, went further. Their front page featured side-by-side illustrations. On the left, sketches of the elaborately costumed guests. On the right, drawings of families in breadlines and children working in factories. The headline read, "To New Yorks." The most damaging coverage came from newspapers outside New York. The Philadelphia Inquirer published an editorial titled, "A Foolish Display," that concluded, "The money wasted on this ball could have fed every hungry family in New York for a month." The Chicago Tribune ran a piece describing the ball as evidence of a ruling class that has lost all connection with the reality of American life. Religious leaders responded with particular fury. On Sunday, February 14th, just 4 days after the ball, ministers across New York and throughout the country delivered sermons explicitly condemning the event. Reverend Dr. William Stephen Rainsford, rector of St. George's Episcopal Church on Stuyvesant Square, one of New York's most prominent churches, used his sermon to attack what he called the shameless display of wealth, while Christian charity goes begging. Reverend Madison Peters of the Bloomingdale Reformed Church was even more direct. His sermon, titled "The Sin of the Bradley Martin Ball," declared that no amount of benefit to dressmakers and florists can justify such extravagance when thousands lack bread. The sermon was reprinted in newspapers across the country. The Jewish community also responded with condemnation. Rabbi Gustav Gottlieb of Temple Emmanuel, one of New York's most prestigious synagogues, preached about the biblical injunction against flaunting wealth before the poor. His sermon drew parallels between the Bradley Martin Ball and the excesses that had led to the destruction of ancient Jerusalem. The public reaction went beyond newspaper editorials and sermons. Within days of the ball, the Bradley Martins began receiving threatening letters. The exact number was never publicly disclosed, but Frederick Martin later acknowledged in his memoir that the family received a great many threats, some of which were serious enough to warrant police investigation. The threats ranged from promises of social ostracism to threats of physical violence. Some letters threatened arson against their properties. Others threatened kidnapping. At least one letter, according to contemporary newspaper reports, threatened assassination and invoked the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette as precedent. The Bradley Martins hired private security guards for their New York residence. They stopped appearing in public. Cornelia Bradley Martin, who had sought to become the most celebrated hostess in New York society, found herself unable to leave her home without facing hostile stares or worse. But the most consequential backlash came from an unexpected source: the New York City Tax Assessor's Office. In March 1897, just weeks after the ball, the Bradley Martins received notice that their property assessments had been substantially increased. Their New York City residence at 20 West 20th Street, previously assessed at $400,000, was revalued at $600,000. A 50% increase. The corresponding increase in their annual property tax bill was dramatic. The reassessment was not limited to the Bradley Martins. Several other families who had attended the ball and whose costumes had been prominently featured in newspaper coverage also received tax increases. But the Bradley Martins' increase was by far the largest and most publicized. The New York Times ran the announcement with an accompanying editorial that made the real reason explicit. The Bradley Martins are leaving America because America has made clear that their kind of ostentatious display is no longer welcome. They have read the writing on the wall. The Bradley Martins departed New York in August 1897, sailing for England aboard the Cunard Line steamship Campania. There was no grand farewell party, no crowd at the dock to see them off. They left quietly, almost furtively, the opposite of the spectacular entrance they had tried to make just 6 months earlier. They would never live in America again. Cornelia Bradley Martin would die in London in 1920, age 72. Frederick would die in 1914, age 65. Both were buried in England, not in the family plots in New York they had once expected to occupy. The ball that was meant to establish them as the preeminent hosts in American society had instead made them exiles. The Bradley Martin Ball of 1897 marked a turning point in American history, though its full significance would only become clear in retrospect. In the immediate aftermath, New York society pulled back from the kind of conspicuous display that had characterized the previous 2 decades. The elaborate costume balls continued, but on a smaller scale and with carefully crafted charitable justifications. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, and other prominent families became more cautious about public displays of wealth. The lesson had been learned. In a democracy, even the very rich could be forced to retreat if they pushed too far. The ball also contributed to a broader political shift. The public outrage it generated fed directly into the progressive era reforms that would reshape American society over the next 2 decades. The movement for graduated income tax, which culminated in the ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913, gained momentum partly from episodes like the Bradley Martin Ball that demonstrated the concentration of wealth in a tiny elite. The estate tax, enacted in 1916, was explicitly designed to prevent the kind of hereditary aristocracy the Bradley Martins had tried to join. Labor reforms, including restrictions on child labor and the establishment of minimum wage laws, were pushed forward by activists who pointed to the contrast between the Bradley Martin Ball and the poverty it ignored. Frederick Townsend Martin himself seemed to understand what had happened. In his 1911 book, The Passing of the Idle Rich, written in exile in England, he reflected on the ball with remarkable honesty. "We were mad, all of us. The ball was a mistake. It was a symbol of an era that was already ending, though we were too blind to see it." The Bradley Martin Ball became a permanent part of American cultural memory as the ultimate example of Gilded Age excess. It has been referenced in countless histories, used as a teaching example in economics and sociology courses, and invoked whenever contemporary displays of wealth during economic hardship spark controversy. The irony is that Cornelia Bradley Martin achieved exactly what she wanted: to throw a party that would be remembered and talked about for generations. She succeeded, but instead of being remembered as a brilliant hostess who brought beauty and culture to American society, she is remembered as the woman who threw a party so tone-deaf, so extravagant, and so perfectly timed to provoke maximum outrage that it helped end the era she was trying to celebrate. The Bradley Martin Ball was not just the party of the century, it was the party that helped end a century.